Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us this evening. It's really great to have so many people here with us. My name is McSorley. I'm the National Coordinator of the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, and I'm very happy to have you here with us for our launch of Defending Civil Liberties in an Age of Counterterrorism and National Security, our 20th anniversary publication. To begin, while we're all joining here from different regions, I'd like to acknowledge that the land from which I'm joining you tonight is the unceded territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. We pay respect to the Anishinaabe Algonquin people, who are the original guardians and ongoing stewards of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call this land home. We honor their courage, past, present, and future, and we welcome the resistance and resurgence of Indigenous peoples as part of the decolonizing process. We're honored and I'm humbled to be joined by three fantastic speakers tonight: Dr. Monia Mazigh, Dr. Pamela Palmater, and Dr. Brenda McPhail, to help us release our new publication. Each of them contributed thoughtful and insightful pieces, and we're grateful for their support. I'd also add that it's been incredible to work alongside all three of them and learn from them during my time at the ICLMG. I'll introduce all three of them more fully in a moment, once we move on to the panel discussion. But first, though, I wanted to share a little bit more about the ICLMG, the work we do, and why we're publishing this collection of essays. As I said, we're joined by three contributors tonight, but we've actually been very lucky to have contributions from 15 wonderful activists, academics, experts, all people who are passionate about fighting for justice, for civil liberties and human rights, and against repressive security measures. Several of them have faced the brunt of these measures firsthand, and we're grateful that they've shared their stories with us. Each of these contributors have also been incredible and important partners in our work over the past 22 years. Many of you may be familiar with the ICLMG, but if you're not, we're a coalition of 46 Canadian organizations from a wide range of sectors, including human rights, civil liberties, legal, faith-based, labor, refugee protection, environmental, and humanitarian groups. The coalition came together in tense and uncertain days following the attacks of September 11th, 2001, as the Canadian government moved quickly to establish new, far-reaching national security and anti-terrorism laws, expanding surveillance and tightening borders. The Anti-Terrorism Act of 2001 was rushed through Parliament with little debate or ability to dissent, in a climate of fear and reactionism. Inside and outside of Parliament, nationalism, suspicion, racism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia spiked. At the time, very few civil society groups in Canada were working on issues of terrorism and civil liberties specifically, and it was clear that a collective response would be needed. Several organizations came together and eventually led to the creation of the ICLMG in 2002, hiring Roch Tassé, who would be the coalition's coordinator for nearly 15 years. For 22 years, we've worked to monitor anti-terrorism laws and actions, analyzing legislation, poring over reports, conducting research, and engaging with policymakers, the press, and the public. We also strove to work closely with people and communities directly impacted by counterterrorism measures. As Roch Tassé writes in his piece for our publication, while immersed in research and policy, we were soon confronted with a human face of anti-terrorism, which drove our agenda for the next 20 years. While we continue this work, there's no doubt and no surprise that a lot has changed. Powers meant to be exceptional are now normalized, from the growing use of secret evidence in courts to dumping water bottles at the airport. Governments don't talk about the war on terror much anymore, but its legacy still looms large. So when the 20th anniversary of 9/11 and the Anti-Terrorism Act came about, and shortly after that, the anniversary of ICLMG, we thought it would be relevant and important to capture what happened in those early days, what we've come up against over the past 20 years, and what it points to for the future. Because while the language may change, from terrorism to extremism to online harms to foreign interference, many of these issues remain the same. We hope we've captured that in this publication, and as we write in the conclusion, we hope it renews or sparks your commitment to the struggle for the protection and promotion of civil liberties from the negative impacts of national security and the war on terror. And so I'm very happy that we launched the publication on our site, and I'm just going to share the cover page with the link for you all to view. It's online now, as you can see, the URLs are there, and I believe my colleague Zan is going to place that in the chat at iclmg.ca/20 years. 20 years, and in French as well at iclmg.ca/fr/20, along with a PDF to download. We're going to be printing paper copies as well, which is great, and they're available for purchase at a sliding scale of $12 to $20, including shipping. The sales are going to help cover the additional cost of publication and creating the publication, and after that, it will go towards the coalition's work. I have to plug the work of the coalition and the resources and the work that we do, and I want to say that while we're a big coalition with 46 members, we're also a small team of 2. And as with most small profits, I think many of you who are joining us tonight know, getting the resources we need to do our work is a challenge. And this can often be true for us and many others, given the issues that we work on. And so while we're primarily member funded, we're also funded by individual donors. We also don't take any government funding. So if you're part of a national organization and would like to become a member of the ICLMG or support our work, I'd encourage you to reach out to us. You can find our email address on our website. It's national.coordination@ICLMG, and we'd be happy to talk. And also as individuals, you can support our work at iclmg.ca/donate. Finally, I also want to acknowledge the great team that helped put all of this together. It's definitely been a huge team effort to get to this point. I'd especially like to thank my colleague Zan Dajne, who's ICLMG's Research and Communications Coordinator, for all their work on the translation, on finding photos and graphics, and really helping to pull everything together, along with Dominique Péchard and Martine Eloi, who are longtime members of the ICLMG and of La Ligue des Droits et Libertés in Montreal, and who are part of our editorial team as editors at large and have really been instrumental in putting everything together. The rest of our planning committee has consisted of Roch Tassé and Pam Foster, and they helped organize tonight's launch and the upcoming launch that will be happening in Montreal on the evening of September 19th, and we'll share more information on that later too. And finally, I'd like to thank Sabine and Shadi at Catasoho Printing and Design in Montreal for all their patience with us putting together the final touches and as we work through this together. So thank you very much to them. Okay, so I'm going to stop screen sharing. There we go. And now we're going to move on to the part that you've really all joined us here for, and that's to hear from our incredible speakers. We're going to have short opening statements from all three. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion, and after that, we'll move to the Q&A. If you'd like to ask questions during the Q&A, we'd ask that you use the Q&A function. That will help us keep track of the questions that are asked and be able to better follow up with them later on. Questions in English and French are welcome, tandis que les présentations seront en anglais. S'il vous plaît, n'hésitez pas à poser des questions en français aussi. Nous les traduirons pour nos intervenants. So without further ado, I'll move on to introducing our first speaker. Dr. Monia Mazigh is an academic, award-winning author, and human rights activist. Her memoir, My Personal Journey with a Scarf, an essay and memoir about gendered Islamophobia, was a finalist for the Governor General Literary Award in the nonfiction category for 2023. Monia's latest novel, Farida, won the Ottawa Book Award for French fiction and will be released in English this fall. She's an adjunct and research professor at Carleton University in the Department of English and Literature. She's also a columnist with Rabble.ca, ONFR+, Islamic Horizons, and has published several articles with the Ottawa Citizen, the Globe and Mail, and the Toronto Star, among other newspapers. Monia currently sits on the boards of several organizations, including the Rideau Institute, the Ottawa Muslim Women's Organization, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, and the Association des auteurs et auteurs de l'Ontario français. She's also a member of the International Advisory Council for the Institute for Canadian Citizenship and sits on the advisory board of Justice for All. And finally, Monia served as National Coordinator of the ICLMG in 2015 and 2016. Thanks for being here, Monia, and looking forward to hear your thoughts tonight.
Thank you, Tim. For the record, some of these organizations, I'm no longer sitting on their board, but that's okay. Let's pretend that I'm still there. But thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to this very important, I assume, and I strongly think, panel. So first of all, also I would like to just wish a happy anniversary to the International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group. Perhaps we dream of the day where ICLMG won't be needed to defend the rights and liberties of people here in Canada, where government will be respecting the rights of all the marginalized group, where privacy would be protected. But in the meanwhile, we will keep supporting and emphasizing on the important role ICLMG does to defend Canadians and other citizens from the abuse of laws in this age of national security and counter-terrorism. I have written some brief remarks here, so I'm going to read from my notes, but I look forward into the discussion with my co-panelists, Brenda and Pam. ICLMG was created, as you mentioned, Tim, in the aftermath of 9/11, when a group of committed and concerned citizens and NGOs came together to create a coalition and defend the rights of Canadians against the hegemony of national security agenda and the so-called war on terror. Indeed, the successive Canadian government introduced and used since 9/11 introduced and used the anti-terrorism legislation mainly to target some marginalized communities and allow more surveillance on groups and individuals that fight for agenda not always necessarily aligned with those of the government, like, for instance, environmental groups, indigenous and land defender groups, anti-capitalist groups, or anti-war and peace groups. Today, 20 years and 2 wars later, the one in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq, one would think that there is no more need probably to denounce the anti-terrorism legislation and its impact on the rights of citizens. However, things are still concerning for many of us, human rights militants. More recently, with the ongoing Israeli genocide on Gaza, we have the impression to watch an increase in the use of those security measures and this national security agenda and its justification in several instances. I will share with you some examples to prove my point. During last winter, the city of Ottawa have given tickets to demonstration organizers who protested the genocide on Gaza in the streets of Ottawa. The City of Ottawa Bylaw Service justified the tickets to the protesters because of the speakers that the organizer used in their marches, alleging that these megaphones disturb the life of the residents. Another example, the students' encampment at several Canadian universities were demonized by many Canadian politicians, falsely confusing the right to peaceful protesting with criminal activities and occupation of private spaces. Some of these encampments were violently raided by the police forces with no valid reason except that they are against the genocide in Gaza and calling for disclosure of universities of their financial statements and ties with companies, many of them in weaponry, supporting the occupation and the genocide in Palestine. Another example, within the last couple of months, the RCMP arrested several Muslim men. One of them originally from Pakistan, was allegedly accused of planning a terror attack targeting Jews in the US. In the news, there has been calling this as a resurgence of ISIS, even though we all know that ISIS has been dismantled and destroyed. Another example, a Muslim father and his son were arrested in Toronto in the summer. Both were allegedly accused of participating in terrorist attack, possessing weapons, and conspiring to commit murders. At this level, we don't have much information about the cases. However, the way they have been treated by the media and the intelligence and law enforcement agency indicate that we are back to the same methods employed during the war on terror: the demonization of Muslim, the scrutiny to the Muslim community and their activities, the presumed association between Muslim and violence, and this time the presumed association of Muslim and anti-Semitism, for instance. The Canadian government even started speaking of the revocation of Canadian citizenship of the accused, to example, the father and son, which would bring us to the Harper era on the war on terror. The media is back using the same Islamophobic tropes, like, and I'm quoting here, this is what they are using in the media: Canada is a breeding ground for terrorism. That was the same thing, the same words that were used in aftermath of 9/11. And another type of, also this another sentence: Canada is a safe haven for terrorists. In the aftermath of 9/11, many new articles, politicians use these tropes to instill fear in the population and justify the introduction of new national security laws, one more restrictive and more far-reaching than the others. No words about the entrapments, about the role of the law agencies in creating these threats. We are just here emphasizing on the terrorism and creating fear among the population. In the meanwhile, we rarely heard about any single arrest of white supremacist individuals or groups who have been arrested under these same laws. According to University of Calgary scholar Michael Nesbitt's, in his research in 2021, 56 individuals were charged with terrorism in Canada between 2001 and 2019. All of them were related to Islamic extremist group or any other groups that would be affiliated with Islamic terrorist activities, with none linked to far-right ideology, despite numerous violent incidents, except in 2023, where 2 individuals from the far right were charged with terrorism. So 2 opposed to 56. Last December and February 2024, 2 young people were arrested here in Ottawa, allegedly for conspiring to commit murder and facilitate terrorist activities. Terms like radicalization that you mentioned, I was the national coordinator of ICLMG. This is what we worked on in between 2015 and 2016. That was the new word, so much in fashion, that now we thought that it's over. No, we are back again using this radicalization, but this time, maybe not directly to ISIS, but somehow inspired from ISIS, but the target is Canadian institution and linked to the war going on Gaza and linked to some sort of Jewish targets. I'm not saying that these are not necessarily rightly so, like, threats, but I am here emphasizing on how we are switching to the same vocabulary, to the same type of threats, to the same type of allegation. And then we have basically, as if we did not really moved from 2001 and all what happened afterwards. Since 2019, 4 violent large-scale military raids were conducted against Wet'suwet'en land defender, with harassment, discrimination, and surveillance against those who were resisting the construction of Coastal GasLink liquefied natural gas pipeline through their unceded territories. So I gave you here a few examples to probably reassure those of us who are saying there is no more war on terror, there is no more need to fight it, and also to create some sort of like more, I think, engagement from whoever is working, and more need to be more serious and more committed to continue denouncing these agenda that are basically intrusive to our privacy, to our actually human rights and other sort of rights that should be protected. So given all these examples and many more, it is very clear that the war on terror and the tools and methods that were developed in the last 2 decades to fight and to fight presumably like the terrorists are still being used today. Probably the only difference, we have new images of who are the terrorists, and we are actually a longer list of who are the terrorists, and also the targeted and the threats are now also different. They switch with time. So it is primordial that we keep denouncing these methods, contesting them, contest these measures, and most of all, exposing them because there is still a lot of ignorance among the general population. So I look forward to the discussion with my co-panelists to dig further into this topic and see how we can collaborate our efforts to push against this surveillance and this violent agenda against human rights. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Monia. It's very inspiring and really gives a great overview and coverage of what we've seen over the past 20 years and what the current challenges are. So thank you very much for that. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Brenda McPhail. Brenda is the director of executive education for the Master of Public Policy and Digital Society program at McMaster University, a program designed to educate the next generation of digital savvy policy actors in Canada. As the former director of the Privacy, Technology and Surveillance program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, Brenda's work has supported litigation at courts up to the Supreme Court of Canada, as well as legislative reform and public education relating to the ways in which privacy rights are at risk in contemporary society. She has appeared as an expert witness before parliamentary and Senate committees regarding privacy law, national security, and biometric data, and serves as a member of the Advisory Council for the Information and Privacy Commissioner of Ontario. She is a collaborator on several grant-funded research projects, including studies on workplace surveillance applications, media governance and AI, facial recognition technology, privacy and consent, and virtual healthcare data privacy. Brenda received her PhD from the University of Toronto Faculty of Information. Thanks for being here, Brenda, and over to you.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It is genuinely a pleasure and a privilege to be here at the celebration of 20 years plus of ICLMG. Before I turn to talk about facial recognition technology, the topic of my chapter and the 20th anniversary publication, I wanted, like Monia before me, to use a minute at this celebratory occasion to acknowledge the extraordinarily important leadership role that ICLMG has played, particularly as a civil society convener and collaborator. As Tim mentioned, I've recently moved to academia, but I got to know ICLMG, and more particularly the work of Tim and Zan at ICLMG, as civil society colleagues and collaborators during my time at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Although, of course, I had heard about the wonderful work of ICLMG under the leadership of Roch and Monia prior to Tim taking over and prior to my time, I had only been the Privacy, Technology and Surveillance Director at CCLA for a fairly short time when Tim took the leadership at ICLMG as their National Coordinator. So I feel as though in some ways we grew into our roles in parallel. And over the last 8 years or so, I've had the gift of often working very directly with Tim and Zan on areas of shared interest, including the no-fly list and the no-fly list kits. The tail end of Bill C-51 and Bill C-59 are problematic national security laws. More recently, C-26 on cybersecurity, C-27 on privacy and artificial intelligence, and C-63 on online harms. Across all of these topics, one of the things that has really stood out is Tim's gifts as a facilitator, who he took and he takes the time to bring people together, not just from across the coalition of groups who are part of the ICLMG, although of course that's his core mandate, but also other groups who work in the same or similar spaces across Canada. Canadian civil society is small, and we're under-resourced. And in some ways, organizations are very competitive because funding is hard, and getting individual attention for our group is one of the ways to attract funding. But also because most of us working in these spaces of rights and privacy and national security and equality are small and under-resourced, there are genuine benefits to coordination and collaboration. And ICLMG under Tim's leadership has been a foundational part of the glue that has bound our groups together. He has always supported, and more often than was fair to expect, from a two-person team, facilitated connection building, initiated information sharing, led joint initiatives and coordination. So from finding agreement across a bunch of different groups of opinionated people who all have organizational mandates that are individual, finding key factors that we can push forward together, leading joint actions, making sure that those precious 5 minutes that each of us get before a parliamentary or Senate committee were used not just to get our points across individually, but to amplify one another in ways for the benefit of people across Canada. Tim has been just a marvel at leading that charge, and I couldn't let this opportunity to thank him be missed. This is just the perfect evening to raise that contribution up. And I know that I speak for members of many other groups with whom you work when I say thank you. It's also, of course, why when Zan and Tim reached out to ask if I'd write something about facial recognition technology for this volume, that I had to say yes. Facial recognition is a topic that Tim and I work on together as steering committee members of the Right to Your Face Coalition, which is a group of people from all walks of life and different kinds of organizations and positionalities who came together because we're concerned about the use of this technology in our society, and we understand the need for public education and political action around regulating this potentially dangerous technology. Surveillance, as Monia has already mentioned, both traditional and digital versions has long been a mainstay of national security and public safety activities. When I do talks with high school students and ask what they think of first, when I say the word surveillance, immediately the first word they come up with, spies or police. In the top 3 is also parents, which is interesting for those of us with kids, but leaving that category of surveillors aside for the moment, it's also true that surveillance in the name of public safety has always raised risks to fundamental rights, not least because the surveillance gaze is too often discriminatory and too prone to overreach and function creep. But new technologies like facial recognition make the risks exponentially greater. Facial recognition technology essentially works by creating a template. You can think about it like a map of your face that allows it to be matched to other images of faces in a database. It's a particularly pernicious form of surveillance in that it can be run on databases of photos collected for completely other purposes, like a passport database, driver's license database, or in some cases, like the infamous Clearview AI facial recognition technology scraped from the internet all of the pictures of ourselves that are put up on professional websites, on social media sites, in defiance of privacy laws and terms of service. It is also pernicious because it operates behind the lenses of cameras that we've been acculturated to believe are there for our safety, as it says on the sticker on the door of the mall, and that have become so familiar over the last couple of decades, we don't even notice them anymore. Facial recognition technology creates risks of discrimination when it doesn't work well. And over the past 5 years or so, there's been a lot of studies that look into the racist outcomes of programs that are only really good at identifying white men. But I'd put it to you that in many ways, it creates even bigger risks when, as they increasingly are doing, they fix it. When we all, regardless of color or gender, become more reliably identifiable by this tool, again, because who gets watched? People, Muslims, people who are Black, Indigenous people will be those same groups who have always been watched. The technology will just exponentially increase the facility to do the watching. Facial recognition technology has the potential to fundamentally and irrevocably change the relationship between an individual and the state. Because it has the potential at its extreme edges to eliminate our right to move around our communities unidentified, either by state actors or any private sector ones who would also invest in the technology, who may indeed be inclined to share it with the state. It's the difference between we saw you and we know who you are. Privacy is a gateway right. Once we lose control over information about ourselves, particularly in something so integral to who we are as our face, that information becomes available for uses that impact other democratic and charter protected rights, particularly, and I know we're going to discuss this later, freedom of expression, freedom of association, and equality rights, as we keep coming back to again and again. When tools like facial recognition technology are used in conjunction with other tools that tap into the digital exhaust that we leave as we move around online, or even offline with our phones in our pockets and location tracking turned on, we're more and more at risk because the privacy gates are not just opened, but run the risk of being torn off their hinges altogether. So getting appropriate regulation for this technology is a fight that Tim and I share. It's one that civil society in Canada, people who care about privacy and security, are in right now. And I'm grateful to know it's yet another fight that, the ICLMG is taking on. I look forward to chatting more about this and all of the other interesting topics a little bit later. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brenda, and thanks so much for those moving words. I really appreciate it, and definitely, if I'm able to work across groups and bring people together, it's because working with people like you make that so much easier. And thanks for everything that you've done and all the work you do, and looking forward to continuing to collaborate and partner on this work. And thanks for those always, insightful thoughts on surveillance and privacy. You really know how to get to the heart of the matter, and yeah, looking forward to talking more about that in a little bit. But next up, we're going to hear from Dr. Pamela Palmater. Dr. Palmater is a Mi'kmaq lawyer and member of the Eel River Bar First Nation in northern New Brunswick. Pam is currently a professor and the chair of Indigenous Governance at Ryerson University. She has been studying, volunteering, and working in First Nations issues for over 30 years on a wide range of social, political, and legal issues. She's also a globally recognized public speaker, trainer, podcaster, and filmmaker, whose compelling voice ignites a fire for social justice and inspires those around her to join in the collective journey towards reconciliation with Indigenous communities. She's a regular contributor to publications like Chatelaine, Maclean's Magazine, and The Lawyer's Daily, as well as broadcasts and TV such as CTV, CBC, Global, and APTN, where she provides insightful analyses on legal, political, social, and economic issues in Canada and the US. Pam holds a BA from St. Thomas in Native Studies, an LLB from UNB, and her master's and doctorate in law from Dalhousie University Law School, specializing in Indigenous and human rights law. Thanks for being here, Pam, and looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thanks so much, Tim, and congratulations on 20 years. Kind of like Monia said, congratulations, not congratulations that we have to be here. I think there'll always be a need to monitor to make sure we're making progress and that we don't revert back. However, the work that everyone's done, Brenda, Monia, everybody associated with International Civil Liberties Monitoring Group, thank you for always including my voice, for including women, for including Indigenous peoples, for including people from, diverse backgrounds, because we may all have similar experiences. We also have very different experiences for different reasons. So for me, I don't even know how I got into national security. I think it was during Idle No More when I started being surveilled and monitored, and I started to wonder, hey, like, why is this still happening? I thought this was just from the old days, but apparently not. So then obviously started doing the research and looking at legislation and cases and everything else, and ended up before Parliament and Senate. It's a very distinct issue for Indigenous peoples, because Indigenous peoples as a whole are not a domestic terror threat to Canada. We've never been a public safety threat or a national security threat or anything under the guise of domestic terrorism whatsoever. However, a disproportionate amount of resources, time, energy, politics, law enforcement, gaze has been directed at Indigenous peoples. Even people you would think, oh my goodness, why on earth are you monitoring someone like Cindy Blackstock? She is like this sweet social worker who bakes cookies for kids and goes to court and tries to get justice for kids. It's just beyond. It's beyond reason, the disproportionate way in which we are surveilled, monitored, tracked, reported on. And I guess if I had to describe it in one particular way, it would be they have manufactured us into a threat. We have never been a threat. We are signing treaties. We wanted to act in peace and friendship, but they've created us as a threat to Canadians, to national security. So much so that they ended up throughout all of their laws and policies. So not just anti-terrorism or national security. If you just only look there, you won't see the whole picture for Native people. But it's all of the ways in which they have criminalized us. So all of the ways in which they prohibited hunting, prohibited fishing, us from gathering timber, us from engaging in our traditional subsistence activities. Like for thousands of years, we were engaged in the trade of tobacco, or in our gaming. All of that now is contraband and organized crime. And so all of the ways in which we have supported ourselves even is now heavily controlled by the state. And if we breach any of those laws, well, now they have this justification, we're criminals and now we have to be monitored. You even have the ridiculousness of people who aren't in a national security or public safety kind of role, like say CSIS or the RCMP, like the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, doing clandestine spying activities where they're diving in the water and putting microchips in lobsters to see if we're fishing and selling lobsters. I mean, it's that ridiculous. At the same time, we don't get the benefit of human rights, Indigenous rights protections from the state. So the state has created us into a threat, manufactured the threat, and put all of its law enforcement and all of its national security, public safety mechanisms towards removing us, suppressing us, institutionalizing us. Why you see the over-incarceration rates, why you see the disproportionate number of police killing Indigenous peoples, why you see the RCMP KERG unit in BC authorized to use lethal overwatch to stop peaceful, unarmed land defenders from simply occupying their territory. So it's a disproportionate response to our very like literally just our existence. So that has been criminalized. The whole surveillance gig, the whole national security gig has really expanded in ways I think even go beyond the legislation. And we know that, with Bill C-51, the so-called anti-terrorism legislation that we were opposing because of all the ways in which it was breaching rights and civil liberties and freedoms. You have a situation where even outside of legislation, the surveillance or national security scope creep is happening. So think of all of the ways in which the RCMP work collaboratively with the extractive industry. So transnational corporations doing joint surveillance, joint monitoring, joint reporting, sharing information back and forth that's private information, that's confidential information, and puts us at risk. They work very much hand in hand. To me, that is well beyond anything that should have been envisioned when you're talking about anti-terrorism, national security, when we're protecting our land rights. And so people keep saying, well, you know, why would they do that? Why would they do that? Why would they pick on Indigenous peoples? You must be just exaggerating this. But we can't forget the economic interest here. So I will be the first to admit, yes, in countries all around the world, we need to be concerned about national security. We need to be concerned about threats to public safety. We want all of us to feel safe. We don't want violence against women. We don't want murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We don't want any attacks on our people in this territory. We don't. So it's very important, and we need tools to do that. The question is, at what point have those tools gone well beyond what's needed for national security and public safety and have entered into the realm of simply protecting economic interests, political interests, like in Bill C-51, where this concept of terrorism started to include basically everything that Indigenous peoples do, right? Interfere with Canada's economic infrastructure. So then when you look at it from an economic point of view, whose interest is at play here? Well, we know that transnational corporations are very much at the heart of much of this surveillance, and they might not call it national security or public safety. However, you've got the RCMP pensions invested in pipelines. You know, you've got law enforcement, former law enforcement quitting their jobs to work for these pipeline companies. You've got contractors it's an entire industry now. I mean, the RCMP has created their own special group, this KERG group, which is just violating the rights of media, journalists, and I know we're going to talk about freedom of expression because that's really important. And I don't think we've looked at the disproportionality, the scope creep, the things that they aren't considering anti-terrorism, public safety, national security, but are effectively using that kind of power, those kinds of authorizations under legislation to subdue, suppress, monitor, surveil, and, you know, keep an eye on Indigenous peoples. And it really does create a not just a scope creep, but a real chill effect. I mean, when you have the Department of National Defense manuals listing Indigenous peoples as insurgents, you know, like that, the way in which they see us, the way in which they monitor us, the fact that Canada would unleash the military in Mohawk territory against Mohawk people. National security is blown out of proportion when it comes to Indigenous peoples, when we know that, just say, if we're just looking at domestic terrorism, so threats from inside, you know, Canadian and US borders, we all know the greatest threat is from these white nationalist groups, at least according to CSIS and the FBI and others. So why the disproportionate looking at Indigenous peoples? And we know there's an economic interest in all of that. I don't think the conflict that the state has with us over our land rights, our water rights, hunting, fishing, our right to be safe from the violence that comes from man camps, I don't think they have the right to use national security and anti-terrorism legislation and tools to use that to fight us on the ground, on the front lines of defending our Indigenous rights. And we know the United Nations has called out for countries all around the world to say they have significant concerns about the ways in which, under the guise of anti-terrorism or national security, states are cracking down on human rights defenders or indigenous land defenders, for example, often in conflicts with mines and pipelines and things like that. So all of these things are exceptionally problematic for Indigenous peoples. And we know that the way in which they've also expanded the ability to share information across federal departments, and you combine that information with the potential of sharing that information with the extractive industry, Coastal GasLink pipeline, Trans Mountain pipeline, like all of these corporations with significant vested interests in also subduing us, you end up looking like it's always those corporations, the state, and law enforcement pitted against us when we actually don't represent a threat. We're not terrorists. We're simply advancing our constitutionally protected rights and our basic human rights. So the fact that we even have to be in this discussion, the fact that Indigenous people have to be in the discussion around national security and anti-terrorism is disturbing in and of itself, because we're placed on the platform of domestic terrorists, and the way they do internal research and their internal ministerial briefing notes saying the worst thing that could ever happen is for environmentalists and Indigenous peoples to get together. Then we'll have eco-terrorism. And so everything that's about protecting the land, now it's eco-terrorism, Indigenous terrorists. And that sends the wrong message to society, but it also means that our rights are being violated in a multitude of ways, even outside of what you would think is national security, how they expand that to stop us from getting land back, from protecting our waters from pipelines, from the vested economic interests. And so for me, significant conflicts of interest. I think there are national security issues that we should care about. There's lots of issues related to gun control, violence against women, the threats from these white nationalist groups. And that's just on the domestic front, and then we have what's happening in the world. So it's not like we don't need to be engaged in national security and public safety and things like that. It's the way they're weaponizing it to counter basic human rights, Indigenous rights, and civil freedoms. That's not what it should be used for. And so we really need to look at how we push back collectively.
Thanks so much for all that, Pam. It was very insightful and really brings, such an important perspective to this work and to the discussions that we're going to have afterwards. And I think, probably will bring a lot of questions from the audience as well too. So thanks for that, and thanks for everything that you do. Well, thanks all three of you for those really great opening remarks and for all your insights. We've prepared a few questions for the panelists to kind of discuss together, and then we'll move on to the Q&A after that. So, I think all three of you touched on this to a certain degree, but the first thing, as you mentioned, one of the things we wanted to talk about was questions of the impact of anti-terrorism and national security laws on dissent and on protest in Canada and freedom of expression. As Monia and Pam, you both mentioned, there's been the example in BC and on Wet'suwet'en territory of the community, in the very Orwellian name of the Community Industry Response Group, which has now, I think they've changed their name to something even more insidious, but I don't have it in front of me right now. But they've had to rebrand because of everything that they've done. And as Monia, you mentioned, the level of crackdowns and criminalization of and attacks on pro-Palestinian and anti-genocide protesters, and what we've seen around accusations there of somehow being linked to terrorism or supporting terrorist organizations has just been really disturbing. And we've also seen, and touching on what Brenda's spoken about, around the growing levels of surveillance of protests and organizers. So I know the three of you touched a little bit on this as in your opening comments, but I wanted to see if there was more that you wanted to add about just how, we're told that these powers have been introduced over the last 20 years to address threats to people in Canada, but that they're not limited to that, and that rather they're used to help maintain the power of the state, that they often use up resources that could be put to a better use elsewhere. And that really that they've been turned on people who are expressing legitimate concerns and engaging in protest and dissent. And so I wanted to have some more comments from you on what you think of that, how you observe that in the work that you do, and maybe even if you have suggestions for, I think, many of the people in attendance say, are involved in some of these movements, and what you would share with them. So I don't know who'd like to go first, but maybe we can unmute everybody, or if you want to unmute and you can kind of jump in as we go, and I think we'll spotlight all of you. So yeah, go ahead, Pam.
Okay, well, interestingly enough, about CERG or whatever they are now, the Civilian Review and Complaints Group has released a report today saying that all of the exclusion zones, remember, they were keeping media out so that we couldn't even see what was happening, all of the rights that they were breaching, that it was unreasonable, and that all of the arrests were also unreasonable. And so you've got a situation where, all right, you're thinking you've manufactured us as a threat to national security. You're worried that we're some kind of eco-terrorists, as well as indigenous terrorists. But now the RCMP itself is circumventing the law. Freedom of expression, the right of the media. Exclusion zones, the courts have already said you can't be doing that. Barring some kind of safety issue, you cannot keep the media from reporting and seeing what's happening on the ground. The same with human rights observers or legal observers by having these exclusion zones. So you've got the RCMP and other bodies and institutions acting outside of the law themselves. They themselves are not following the rule of law, and they're not even acting in a democratic way. So no matter what it is that we're doing in this country, there is always the Constitution. There is always protected rights and freedoms and freedom from arbitrary arrest and detention. And when Indigenous journalists continue to be arrested, in addition to being put in exclusion zones, then we can't even get the information to be able to advocate, to be able to say, here's some evidence-based policy recommendations to make changes to these things. And so that's what concerns me, the ways in which they can work outside of the law, outside of the rule of law, with pretty near impunity and with some degree of anonymity, right? Because within the national security framework or public safety framework, there's a lot of, hidden court proceedings, hidden information, protected information, redacted information. And so if they now go on the front lines, violate basic Canadian law, the right to free speech, the right, the freedom of the press, then we won't even get to see what's happening. And seeing that they're already acting outside of the law, it makes it even doubly important that we see what's happening in terms of national security, public safety, or any kind of enforcement activities on citizens.
Thanks so much, Pam. And that's a great note about that report coming out today. We'll be sure to look it up. And maybe just to mention that civilian oversight body for the RCMP, there's currently work being done to expand that to include the Canada Border Services Agency and reform that body so that they have more powers and more independence of investigation. So that'll be critical for follow-up on that. So thanks so much. Brenda or Monia, would you like to jump in?
Sure.
Maybe I'll go to Brenda and then
I'll go. As I say in my piece in the publication, when we're watched and we're known, we're very likely less willing to speak up on controversial issues. It sounds like a cliche, but in fact, We have amazing Canadian scholarship. People like Adam Molnar, Jeff Monahan, David Lyons, and the whole Surveillance Center team, John Penny, who have done, amazing, rigorous research that demonstrates that it's not just a cliche, it's true. When we feel like our browsing might be monitored, we're not just less likely to look up, how do I make a pipe bomb? We're less likely to look up how do I cure a sexually transmitted disease? How do I acquire health care for an illness? So it matters. When we feel like we're watched, when we feel like the state is paying attention to things within the zone of our sphere of our private life, it actually affects the way we live and how we behave. And that makes us less likely to protest or stand up for causes we believe in. A long time ago, I did some research that in the end we never published for various reasons, where we talked to activists and people who had been on the front lines of protests about whether they'd been monitored and how they'd been monitored and how that impacted them. And one of the things that has stuck with me the most were young parents saying, you know what, I can't do it anymore. I can't put my body on the line because it's not just my body anymore. It's my partner, it's my baby who are at risk. So we can't underestimate the sort of personal toll that the state surveillance apparatus takes on people who have causes that they believe in and who want to stand up and try to make things better in their communities and in our society. I think that's the first thing. The other thing I would just flag, our freedom of expression is also right to hear. Pam has spoken really eloquently about the ways that the freedom of the press and the limits to press access affect our expressive rights. It's not just freedom of the press that's affected. It's our rights of expression, because we also have the right to hear and know about the ways that our law enforcement forces, our national security forces, and others in our society are behaving. The last little thing I'd add, so many kinds of surveillance technologies, whether it's body cams for police or facial recognition technology or drones or geofencing or cell tower dumps, all of those things can be leveraged to inhibit protest or to criminalize protesters. And we, as those who care about these things, are really fundamentally in the position of having to keep fighting on the level of individual police forces who acquire these technologies, who may or may not develop individual policies that are relevant, often at the level of each technology, not across the board, but each technology. So a series of fight after fight after fight has to happen if we want to try and get prohibitions in places where we think that, these kind of tools are going to be leveraged against lawful and peaceful protest. And at the same time, and Pam has said this again really clearly, we're hampered by the theory of operational secrecy. That means that it's really hard to get information to even know if the prohibitions that we do win, that are embedded in policies, are being respected. So it's a really difficult area. I think it's important not to underestimate the risk that of damage to expressive rights that happens in these kind of surveillance environments. It's not just, oh yeah, they're police and they're going to have cameras. We have been too acculturated to believe that that's the way it should be, just because currently that's the way it is.
Thanks for that. Monia, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Pam and Brenda. Well, I think what happened is that, Pam, you mentioned how there was this fabrication of threat and make people, assume that a community is a danger to the national security of the state, right? Unfortunately, I think that has been probably, one of the reasons of the existence of Canada. You have to find always a security a threat to justify your existence. And I think, yes, it is very, I mean, for years and up to today, the indigenous community have been described into the imaginary of the population, of the Canadian population, that they are the one who maybe one day they can come and take back the land, right? This kind of idea. We find the same thing in the United States with this idea that the Black people, I mean, the reason of people in the United States having their right to hold guns is that what if one day the Black people are going to go back and take revenge, and so I think it is very interesting that, yeah, there is constantly this creation of threats. Maybe some of them at the very, very beginning, or maybe, you can find some justification, but most of the time this justification is increased, it's, exaggerated, and not only exaggerated, it becomes the reason of new policy, the reason of these abuse of counter-terrorism measure. So I think it has been always the case, and it's still going on. The same thing that we are watching today with, for example, the immigrant population and the Muslim population, for instance. After 9/11, Muslim communities became the threat to the national security of Canada, even though, if you think about it, we did not have a 9/11 in Canada. We did not have any sort of motivated, like very well explicit. I mean, yes, there were some violence, but there were not any sort of explicit Islamic or any sort of Islamic based source of violence in Canada. The most violent groups in Canada are the white supremacists, and this is, this has been documented. So I think it's always good for these institutions, part of the government, to create this sense of fear. And let me be here a little bit kind of blunt. It's like the majority of the Canadian population buy into this sort of rhetoric. We are going to make you feel safe. However, the safety, we tell Canadian, or the government tells Canadian, we are going to make you safe, but they don't tell them at what expense, at what extent the safety is going to be built. It's going to be built at the expense of their privacy. It's going to be built at the expense of other communities. And people do not kind of realize that these are other communities. They are actually bearing most of the price of the security that has been, created. This false idea of threat that has been sort of created. I mean, yes, there are threats everywhere, and you can never reach zero sort of statistics of society free of threats or of violence. But I think to just turn the attention into some community, this is where things become very, very problematic. And that shows that it's not really the security that we are. It's this false sense of security, but also this exaggerated sense of threat from those security. So yes, you mentioned the domestic, the indigenous people, but also for many, many years. I mean, even before 9/11, people like the Italian used to be really like the source of, for example, the threats to the safety of Canada. The Japanese Canadian, the Chinese Canadian, up to today as well, they are kind of represented in the media as they are the one, when we talk about foreign interference, we never talk about the American. I mean, everybody knows that this is the huge elephant sitting there in the room, dictating all the rules, and everybody is thinking about China. Nobody talks about, for example, Israel, right? And the huge influence it has on politicians and on politics here. And on, so I think it's very interesting here to see how those threats are created, exaggerated, and maintained constantly. I mean, for some time, the Russian also represented that and still do up to today. So I think it is very interesting to see there is, yes, a domestic one, but there were successive also foreign source of threats, the immigration in general. All immigrants in this country has been at some point of time represented as a threat, sometimes not to the national security, but we know recently there is this threat of the homogeneity of the ethnicity, or this kind of theory of the great replacement. Because of the immigrant, they are breeding a lot of more people, and basically the population, its homogeneity, its ethnicity is going to change. So I think all this is it is part of maintaining those huge, intrusive, far-reaching national security, of course, with justification of their existence, of the budget behind them, and of their power within many, many spheres of our lives. And that has a big, huge impact, of course, on our freedom of expression, because for many, many years, after 9/11, many students were, for example, in the campuses, Muslim students, they were visited by the CSIS. Many workers have been visited by CSIS in their workplace, and still going on today. What's going on in Palestine, the genocide there, it's increasing this idea of you cannot speak, you cannot really say whatever you think. So yeah, there is this chill effect, definitely, that those threats, imagined, exaggerated, created, they would have necessarily a big impact on those population who are supposed to be, in the society. They have less rights. They are the one who are supposed to be helped, not the one to be feared of. So
Thanks so much, Monia, and thanks to all three of you for those really insightful comments. And it really makes us think about how these anti-terrorism laws and national security laws go much further than what they're proposed or justified as being by the government. I have a couple just some updates for people. We had mentioned CERG and what they've become renamed to as the Critical Response Unit, and they're going to be looking more broadly at protests in general. So that thanks to Ashlyn from the BC Civil Liberties Association is here who shared that. And just from Irina Sarek, who shared also that there's a cross-Canada network working on challenging and ultimately abolishing the CERG/CRU. And you can find out more about them at abolishcirg, abolishcirg.org if people are interested in checking that out. And just to say, in addition to some, what you've all shared, there's two pieces of legislation that one that's passed and one that we're currently working on that I wanted to mention that touch on freedom of expression as well, just really briefly. One is the foreign interference laws, and that's what Monia was touching on. But there are a lot of components around the new Foreign Interference Act that was passed very quickly in the spring that touch on freedom of expression as well, including the need and the government creating a new registry for foreign influence, which raises a lot of questions around who will have to register and why, and what the impact that could have on valid partnerships and cooperation with international partners, engaging in international solidarity work, and things like that, and the stigmatization that can come along with this kind of registry, and who has to register and who won't have to register. And that's still not clear. So that's an ongoing issue. And many of you may also be familiar with Bill C-63, which is the Online Harms Act, which in and of itself, again, isn't a national security act, but we find in it this idea that it would regulate incitement to terrorism above and beyond the rule that it also proposes to regulate incitement to violence. So this idea that beyond just content that incites somebody to violence, that we need something extra that's based on terrorism, as if it's a separate category rather than just incitement to violence in general. It adds that political component that can mean that there's an interpretation. Is something considered violent because it's a call to violence, or is it considered violent because you disagree with the issue that's proposing and you view that as, you know, being linked to some form of terrorism? And we can think, you know, very clearly about how the accusations against pro-Palestinian solidarity activists right now as being supportive of terrorism, that their calls to engage in protest and take action, you know, could very well fall under these new proposals. So that's some of the ongoing work. We did have a couple more prepared questions to ask, but we have a lot of great questions from the audience. So I think maybe in the interest of time, we'll move over to those, if that's okay with everyone. First, before I do that, I also wanted to just quickly acknowledge that we have a lot of the contributors from the magazine and publication who are here with us, and I just wanted to acknowledge them before we kind of go forward. So I'd just like to say thanks to Dominique Péchard, Janet Dench, Jen Moore, Matthew Behrens, Patricia Poirier, Roch Tassé, Roger Clark, Martine Eloi, and Khadija Keji, who are all here with us tonight. And thanks for joining us on the webinar, and thanks for your contribution to the publication. And I hope people are downloading it and checking out the site and sharing it around so you can read the wonderful contributions that you made to it. So moving on to some of the questions, you know, we've touched on some questions of immigration, but there's an interesting question that's been posed by Joanna Beru that I wanted to share with all of you and see if you have thoughts. And Joanna is saying that would love panelists' comments about former Conservative Immigration Minister Jason Kenney and current Immigration Minister Mark Miller's collaboration with a group called Lawyers for Secure Immigration and B'nai B'rith Canada's call and response to manufacture an immigrant terrorist crisis. And so maybe to give a bit more context, because we've seen a little bit of this, that as Monia mentioned, there's been this resurgence of this idea that our immigration system is full of holes and is letting all these terrorists into Canada, which we know simply isn't true. And there are groups that have been formed. One of them is this group, Lawyers for a Secure Canada, who are propagating this idea and pushing for action to be taken. And so I was wondering if any of you would be interested in maybe commenting a little bit more on this idea of this manufactured crisis that of we need to, you know, clamp down on our borders once again because the Canadian government is letting these, you know, letting too many terrorists through, which is, you know, we can, anyways, there's more I could say on it, but I want to hear from you. So so I'll leave it open to any of you who want to comment on that. Thanks.
If I can say, I'm not going to be, I will try to be brief here. Actually, I'm not aware of this group at all, so I wouldn't comment directly on this one. However, I would like to remind, and probably many of the participants know that already, but it's good to remind that after 9/11, we have exactly a similar pattern. And I'm not trying to say that what's going on right now, it's, you know, it's a copy of what happened, but it's, in my sense, it is a repetition. It's déjà vu. We have already seen this before. So this is not new. So what can tell us is that at least we are comforted that a lot of this is not true. A lot of this is basically a fabrication of that is going to help politicians to be elected. It's going to help some groups also to get more funding. And yeah, it's absolutely, it's an industry. It's the industry of fear. And this is not something that I am imagining. There is a lot of, you know, when we talk about the industry of Islamophobia, when, you know, it is an industry. People benefit out of this, they make money out of this, there are stakeholders. So the same thing with this anti-immigrant sort of policies and narrative that is spreading. It has been already spreading in Europe, and I think we are getting it more and more here in Canada as well, through those same white supremacist groups. So remember, I'm just giving maybe a few examples. After 9/11, I remember it very well because I was personally affected with this personally. Time magazine ran a special edition about how Canada became a safe haven to terrorists. And they gave 4 examples of men who were arrested in Canada. One of them was my husband, I remember at that time, and giving these examples that Canada is becoming this safe haven for terrorists. And remember the fake news that all the terrorists came, the one who attacked the 2 towers in the United States came through Canada to the United States. That was a widespread, even though those people who came to Canada, the attackers, you know, the one who committed the attacks were on visa. They were legitimate sort of like students or, so I think this idea of that, you know, the outsiders are coming to invade us, the outsider are changing our ethnic homogeneity, those, you know, who are, yeah, even there is this idea of raping our women, this idea, it has been used in Europe as well. The immigrant are rapers, they are stealers. So I think this is not new, but it is scary to see that there are organizations working with political parties to propagate them even more. And so what I suggest, maybe for ICLMG or for other groups, is to dismantle those narratives and to know who are these groups behind it. It's a lot of work, research, but I think it's worth it because you fight the obscure and, you know, with transparency, with who they are, with research, with facts. So I think this is what I believe at this point in time to do. Is it true? What are your numbers? You know, Harper did the same thing. And I think today, with the pressure that this government is facing from the right groups and from, you know, the conservatives, they are trying to adopt some of these policies of, yeah, anti-immigration. Yeah, because they are talking of revoking the citizenship. Remember, Trudeau said the Canadian is a Canadian is a Canadian, right? And now it's the same government who are thinking of revoking the citizenship of some of these men who is suspected of conducting or of conspiring, whatever, right? A terrorist attack.
Great. Thanks so much, Monia. And yeah, no, a lot of really important points. And I think, you know, it also points to what we're seeing in the efforts to bring people from Gaza to Canada, and this idea that we need a stricter immigration system and screening process for individuals coming out of Palestine because of this worry that, you know, who knows, the, you know, the allegations that they could all be terrorists and we don't know who they are. And so that we need to, you know, be stricter than when we're, you know, engaging in support to bring people out of other humanitarian crises to Canada. So thanks so much for those comments.
And Tim,
and good ideas of where to go. Yeah, go
I'd
ahead.
love to just add that, you know, we need to have these conversations based on fact. You know, if we're looking at legal issues, policy issues, changes in policy, things that are a concern, let's make it based on evidence. Show me the evidence that immigrants are just coming in en masse, terrorists, and doing all of these things. Then we'll have a discussion if that's the problem. But we haven't seen those statistics. We've actually seen the threats in terms of domestic terrorism, threats to us, not immigrants. It's actually these far right white nationalists, hate groups. And so we've got to it sounds naive, but you have to depoliticize these things. If you're going to make legal and policy decisions as a leader, you need to make them based on evidence instead of using these things as dog whistles to achieve your racist agenda. You know, it's kind of like when you hear provincial premiers say, oh, we have to address rural crime. They're not talking about rural crime. They're talking about cracking down on Indigenous peoples and Indigenous peoples being able to hunt and fish all over their lands and things like that. So it's the same thing with this. You know, immigrants are terrorists and we're letting in all of these dangerous people. That's really just a dog whistle for, hey, we don't want others. We don't want people that aren't like us that could contaminate this, you know, what did Stephen Harper call it? Old stock Canadians or something like that. So, and we need to call that out, call it out for what it is. And I think if we had a fact-based discussion, we would see that the lay of the land is not quite how it's presented by the people that are in power.
Thanks for that, Pam. And yeah, and that's definitely a challenge when there's so much secrecy and lack of transparency around these national security questions. Yeah. We have another question that's directly for Brenda, but I guess everyone can chime in. But this one is coming from James Turk. And Brenda, he's wondering if you could share some suggestions about some of the regulations that would be important to limit the misuse of facial recognition in Canada.
Thanks, Jim, for that very specific question. Fortunately, it is something that I have been thinking about quite a bit. We all probably know that there is, and you've talked about it already. I apologize if you can hear my dog nipping in the background. She just came back from her walk. We have legislation on the table, privacy legislation for private sector privacy, and also a new AI Act. Neither of those, as they currently exist, despite a study by the Ethics Committee of Parliament a couple of years ago, actually address the problems with facial recognition that were identified by our own government and its committee in 2019. The legislation proposed and currently on the table in 2024 doesn't get there. We need to define biometric information as preemptively sensitive, qualifying it for the strongest possible protections, both in terms of data security and potential use. We need to remove the carve-out currently in Bill C-27 that potentially would allow private sector companies to use facial recognition technology under the auspices of a legitimate business purpose. And we all know that security is one of the most legitimate business purposes, right? And in Canada, we've already had cases where private sector companies have been shown to be using this technology and it's resulted in discriminatory impacts. In the US, you've probably all heard the story of the several Black men who were wrongfully accused. In Canada, unsurprisingly, our first published case, to the best of my knowledge, was an Indigenous person in Winnipeg. So we need to get rid of the idea that it's a legitimate business purpose to use invasive technologies for private sector purposes. And then we need to take more seriously the idea that privacy is not just an individual right, but a collective and community right, and correspondingly protect against collective harm from these kinds of technologies. Many places in the US increasingly are creating their own standalone biometric protection statutes. Illinois has one of the granddaddies of those acts. We call it the BIPA fondly. And people in Illinois have benefited from protections against companies like Clearview AI. That state was able to take that company to court under that law and make them purge their database of the faces of Illinois residents. Canada lacks that legislation and is currently in courtroom battles in BC and Alberta. Not sure whether it started yet in Quebec. I'm not sure whether the federal case is launched yet. There was notice filed that one might, where Clearview AI is challenging the decision of privacy commissioners across Canada to declare their use of scraping of information illegal, partially on free expression grounds. We need legislation that would preempt that kind of a nonsensical court case. So those would be the three top ones: sensitive information, remove the carve-outs, and bolster acknowledgement of individual harm with collective harm. To top it off, we might revise the ADA too, just for fun. And like the European Union, prohibit the use of facial recognition technology for purposes of mass surveillance. We can fight about whether they did it well and how they weakened that provision, but the bottom line is they have a no-go zone that we very much need in Canada, and we should have the political will to create that kind of protection for people across the country.
Thanks so much, Brenda. And yeah, and just to say, you know, your work on this, and especially at committee, has been so valuable and kind of leading the way on what needs to be done. And for those who are following it, C-27, the bill is going to be back at committee in the next few weeks, and so we'll be working with Brenda and others to keep pushing to make sure that changes are put into place and make sure that MPs hear some of these concerns. We're running towards the end of our time. And we have two questions left. So I thought I would throw them both out there, and you can choose to answer either one. But one comes from Anne Rogers. And Anne's asking that given the abuse/mission creep we've seen with Canadian anti-terrorism laws, which didn't exist prior to 9/11. Sorry, I just need to go back to it. Right, there we go. 9/11. Can we think about campaigning to abolish them entirely? Planning and carrying out acts of violence are illegal anyway, and can be used against, the current laws can be used against specific threats. So that's one question. It's a big one. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. And the last question that we had wanted to ask you is that, you know, it's not a secret that the kind of work that all three of you do and that many of the contributors to this publication do can be difficult. They can be draining. It's heavy issues, and a lot of it is also very personally relevant. You know, and from our own work at ICLMG, we know that often new issues come up, and it can take years to try and address it while you're still dealing with the last, you know, the last campaign or previous, you know, concerns. So I was wondering if you have advice, or what advice you would have for people engaging in this work, for continuing this work. How do you keep going? And also, Brenda touched on it before, and you know, how important, you know, in doing coalition work and groups working together, how important and what's the relevance of bringing people together across a wide range of groups and sectors to kind of do this work together? So it's two very different questions. So have your pick, or if you have a few thoughts on both, you know, please go ahead. But yeah, we'd love to hear your thoughts on those.
I can try first one. Abolishing the anti-terrorism legislation. Yes, that's a very, very legitimate sort of call. And I think that was the call at the very beginning of many human rights activists. When Bill C-36, I think this is how it was called, the first anti-terrorism legislation that was brought by the Liberal of Jean Chrétien at that time. A lot of the organization against the anti-terrorism legislation was calling for, we don't need it. We have a criminal code that can deal with these offenses anyway. And I think over and over, and the statistics I mentioned from 2001 to 2019, 56 people from Muslim faith were charged under and arrested and charged under the anti-terrorism legislation. That's, speaking of facts and numbers, that speaks on its own that this anti-terrorism legislation has been basically not made for all Canadian, which I guess, I'm not a lawyer, but it can be one of the arguments against its anti-constitutionality, because it is not for all Canadian. It is targeting a group of Canadian. However, things are not as simple and easy as we wish, and they should be. And we don't only have Bill C-36, the anti-legislation, or there, but it had even kids and children, and with Harper having Bill C-51 and then the C-59 with the Liberal government. So I think ideally, yes. On the ground, I think it is very difficult because this is a narrative that has been sold to the Canadian over and over. We are having these laws to make you feel safer. And many people do not really understand the harms because maybe the average Canadian is not concerned by these laws. But a lot of communities, the Indigenous community, the one who are, from like the students, many of them, and the Muslim community and the charities, they are really like a prime target of these laws. We don't need them, I think, theoretically speaking, but politicians need them for sure.
Thanks, Monia. Yeah, that's a great point. This idea that we don't need them, but the politicians do. It's I think that's very, yeah, speaks to the heart of the issue. Yeah, thank you. Pam or Brenda? Pam, go ahead.
Yeah. So just to the second issue around advocacy and the work that we do, obviously it's very difficult. Some of it's very, very heavy. Today dealing with an RCMP killing yet another Indigenous person, 6 Indigenous people killed in the last 2 weeks by RCMP and Winnipeg Police Service. So it's ever present. It's always there. And it can be very, very overwhelming. And I know a lot of Canadians have said, I feel like I can't do anything. There's just so much to do. And will it ever stop? And I always say this, Matt. Oh, are you still there?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I always say this. Imagine if we weren't there. If we all just said, this is too hard. I don't care about privacy. I don't care about immigration. I don't care about human rights. And all of the activists just stopped. I mean, we are literally what holds up and protects democracy, human rights. There are countless things that we end up preventing that we'll never know because we ended up preventing it. We do everything we can to push back against, regression and undoing rights and things like that. So as hard as it is, it's important work. I think I always just try to keep in mind, I can't do it all. So don't try to do it all. I'm in the Indigenous sphere. Someone might be in the privacy sphere. Someone might be in the environmental sphere. Someone might be in someone else. And it's the fact that we always work collaboratively. So it's like, okay, I don't have to do it all because in my little sphere, that's enough as it is. And I think if Canadians can just look at it that way and start local and say, okay, what's the local call to action wherever you are, whether it's for environmental protections, whether it's human rights, whether it's anti-terrorism, just start local, pick something, support, sign a petition, write a letter, be boots on the ground, do financial support, whatever it is. You don't have to do it all because we certainly can't do it all, but we need the backup. We really do need the backup because we are the ones effectively stopping the floodgates of just entire political power, entire, authoritarianism, police state, economic interests being everything over basic human rights. So it's really important work. You don't get rich doing that work. You certainly don't get famous doing that work, but it is very fulfilling work to think about protecting human rights at a very basic level. And so for Canadians, start local, find out where you can help in safe ways. And that will go a long, long way to helping all of us who are on, like in the media, for example, or on the front lines.
In the last couple minutes, I would just take on and I guess really reiterate what Pamela said, which is working in and with community is so foundational to be able to keep going. Remember the shoulders you stand on and the shoulders that are beside you. Because on it, sometimes just surviving to fight again is the only win you get. So having people to commiserate with, having people to strategize with, having people who remind you to celebrate the baby steps that you make is so important because all of us in our own ways are engaged in what is fundamentally generational work. So we need to work together to try and create the big tent multi-generational groups that are going to give us the capacity not just to fight now, but to carry the fight into the future. And celebrating the work, not just the wins, is important. So it's been such a privilege to be here tonight while we're celebrating many wins, but also just the work that ICLMG has been doing for the last 20 years.
Thanks so much, Brenda. And thanks everyone. Yeah, those are, great words to end on, and very, I think that's, what we need to kind of keep doing this work and keep moving forward. Being able to do this event and have all you here and hear, your thoughts and just the, I knew tonight would be really wonderful and insightful, but it's gone beyond, I think, what we could have expected. So thanks so much to all three of you for being here. And it's, through working with people like you as our partners and collaborators and friends that we're able to keep doing this work. And, as we say, we don't want to be around for another 20 years. But if we are, the best part is being able to work with all of you. So, with that, thanks so much for being here tonight. Thanks to everyone who joined us. We'll be posting the video of this in short order. Again, if you want to check out the full publication, you can go to iclmg.ca/20 years or 20 ans. And I'm sure we'll be crossing paths again very soon in all the work we do. So thank you, everyone. Thanks to everyone for joining, and have a nice evening. Take care.
Bye.
Good night.